The wealthy woman was screaming at the homeless boy, accusing him of stealing her wedding ring right there in the grocery store checkout line, and everyone was staring and waiting for security to come. But then the boy said something that made the entire store go silent, made the woman's face drain of all color, made me understand I was witnessing something impossible. "Your husband gave it to me," the boy said, his small voice carrying across the sudden quiet, and I felt the world tilt sideways. The woman had been counting money from her expensive leather wallet when her diamond ring disappeared from her finger, and the first person she looked at was this small boy in torn shoes who had been standing by the jewelry display case. 8 years old maybe, with dark hair falling across his forehead and eyes that seemed too old for his face. He had been pressing his nose against the glass, leaving small fog circles that disappeared as quickly as they formed. "You took my ring," she had said, her voice sharp and cutting, and I watched the boy shake his head but not speak, his small hands pressed flat against his sides. She demanded he empty his pockets, and when she found only a marble, blue and white swirls like tiny clouds, her voice got louder, more desperate. "Where is it? Where's my ring?" Then the boy reached into his other pocket and pulled out a different ring entirely. Plain gold, thin and scratched, and when the light hit it we could all see the inscription inside, "Forever, David." That's when he said it. "Your husband gave it to me. I was just buying milk when it started. Just milk and those small ceramic bowls with the blue flowers that reminded me of something I couldn't name, standing in line behind this woman whose diamond ring caught the fluorescent lights every time she moved her hands and threw small rainbows against the wall. I should have been thinking about whether I needed anything else, whether I had remembered to lock the car, but something about the boy made me keep watching. Not gone exactly, but not on her finger anymore, and she was looking at her hand like it had betrayed her, turning her palm up and down, checking between her fingers, and I could see the pale band of skin where the diamond had been. "My ring," she said, more to herself than anyone else, and then louder, "My ring is gone." The boy was still there by the display case, and I saw him stiffen when she turned toward him, his small hands pressed flat against his sides. "You," she said, and her voice had changed, become something sharp and cutting, "you took my ring." He shook his head but didn't speak, and I found myself holding my breath, waiting for something I couldn't name. The checkout girl stopped scanning items and looked up, her mouth slightly open, and the man behind me shifted closer to see what was happening. The woman took a step toward the boy, then another, and I could see her hands shaking. "I saw you looking at it," she said, and her voice was getting louder now, carrying across the small space, "You were staring at my ring and now it's gone." She turned to the checkout girl, to the man behind me, to me. "This boy stole my wedding ring." The boy still hadn't moved, but I could see something change in his face, a kind of closing off, like he was pulling himself somewhere deep inside where her words couldn't reach him. "I didn't steal nothing," he said finally, so quiet we had to lean forward to hear him. "Empty your pockets," the woman said, and when he didn't move fast enough she reached for him, her hands grabbing at his jacket, and I heard myself say, "Wait," without meaning to, without planning to speak at all. Everyone turned to look at me then, and I felt my face get hot, but I couldn't stop watching the boy's face, the way his eyes had gone very wide and very still. The woman had found something in his pocket, pulling out a small object that caught the light, and for a moment I thought she was right, thought this small boy in torn shoes had somehow taken her ring, but when she opened her hand we could all see it was just a marble, blue and white swirls that looked like tiny clouds. "Where is it?" she said, and her voice was breaking now, desperate. "Where's my ring?" The boy looked at the marble in her hand, then at her face, then at all of us watching him, and something shifted in his expression. He reached into his other pocket, slowly, and pulled out a ring. Not hers, this one was plain gold, thin and scratched, but when the light hit it we could all see the inscription inside, "Forever, David." "Your husband gave it to me," the boy said, and his voice was so small I almost missed it. The woman went very still. "What did you say?" "Your husband," the boy said again, and I could see tears starting in his eyes, but he didn't look away from her face. "He gave me this ring and he told me to wait for you here, told me you'd come looking for it." The silence stretched between them like a taut wire, and I could feel everyone in the store holding their breath. The woman's face had gone completely white and she was staring at the ring in the boy's hand like it might disappear if she looked away. "That's impossible," she whispered. "My husband is dead." The boy nodded, very slowly, and I watched him take a small step toward her. "I know," he said. "He told me." I have never heard silence like that before. It was the kind of quiet that makes your ears ring, makes you aware of your own heartbeat, makes you realize how much noise the world usually makes. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead and somewhere in the distance I could hear music playing, but it all felt very far away from where we stood in this small circle around a boy who couldn't have been more than 8 years old, holding a ring that belonged to a dead man. The woman's hands were shaking now, really shaking, and she reached out toward the boy but stopped before touching him. "When?" she asked, and her voice was barely a whisper. "3 days ago," the boy said. "He was sitting by the fountain, the one with the angel, and he looked real sad. I asked him why he was crying and he said he had to go away but he needed someone to give you this ring, needed someone to tell you he was sorry." The woman made a sound then, something between a sob and a gasp, and I felt tears start in my own eyes without understanding why. The boy was still holding the ring, still looking at her face, and I could see something in his expression that was too old for someone his age, too knowing. "He said you'd be angry," the boy continued, and his voice was steady now, stronger. "He said you'd think someone was lying to you or trying to trick you, but he said to tell you about the blue teapot, the one you broke on your first anniversary and cried about for 3 days. The woman's knees buckled and the checkout girl reached out to catch her, helped her to a chair someone had brought from the coffee shop next door. She was crying now, really crying, and I could see her whole body shaking with it. "He said to tell you it wasn't your fault," the boy said, and he was crying too now, tears running down his cheeks. "He said you couldn't have known about the pills, couldn't have stopped him, and he was sorry for leaving you alone." I found myself thinking about all the times I had stood in lines like this one, buying milk and small things I didn't really need, watching people and wondering about their stories. The woman with the diamond ring had been just another stranger, someone whose life barely touched mine, but now I was watching her world split open and I couldn't look away. The boy walked over to where she sat and held out the ring. He said this was supposed to be buried with him but he kept it because he couldn't let go, couldn't stop thinking about your wedding day and how happy you looked when he put it on your finger the first time. She took the ring with shaking hands and I could see her turning it over, looking at the inscription, and I knew without being told that she recognized it, that this was real somehow, impossible but real. The boy stood there waiting while she examined it, and I watched his face, trying to understand how someone so young could carry such a heavy message. "He said you come here every Tuesday," the boy said, wiping his nose on his sleeve. "He said you buy milk and those little bowls with flowers on them because they remind you of your grandmother's dishes, and you always stand in this line because it's the one that faces the fountain where you met him." The woman looked up at him then, really looked at him, and I could see recognition dawning in her eyes. "You've been watching me," she said, but there was no accusation in her voice, just wonder. "He asked me to," the boy said. "He said you'd come eventually and I should wait for you, should make sure you got the ring. He said it was important." I watched the woman close her hand around the ring, watched her shoulders shake with silent sobs, and I felt something shift inside my chest, something I hadn't felt in a long time. The boy was looking at her with such gentleness, such careful attention, and I realized he wasn't just delivering a message, he was holding space for her grief, creating room for her to feel everything she needed to feel. The man behind me had moved closer and I could see him crying too, not trying to hide it, and the checkout girl had tears streaming down her face. We were all strangers but we were all connected now by this moment, by this impossible story unfolding in front of us. "Why you?" the woman asked finally, looking at the boy. "Why did he choose you?" The boy was quiet for a long moment, considering her question. "I asked him that too," he said finally. "He said because I understood what it felt like to be alone, to have important things to say but no one to say them to. He said we were the same that way." I found myself thinking about the boy's clothes, the way his shoes were worn through at the toes, the careful way he had stood by the display case like he was used to being told to move along. He was homeless, I realized, or close to it, and somehow this woman's dead husband had found him and trusted him with something precious. "He said you volunteer at the shelter downtown," the boy continued, and the woman nodded, tears still flowing. "He said you go there because you miss taking care of someone, miss having someone to worry about. He said maybe after you got the ring, maybe you'd want to worry about me for a while." The woman looked at him then with such intensity I felt like I was intruding just by watching. "What's your name?" she asked. "Marcus," he said. "But everyone calls me Marc." "Marc," she repeated, and I could see her testing the name, seeing how it felt in her mouth. "How long have you been alone?" "Since my mom died," he said. "About a year now. I've been staying at the shelter sometimes, but they're always full and I don't like the noise much anyway." The woman was quiet for a long moment, turning the ring over in her hands. "David," she said finally, and I knew she was talking to someone who wasn't there. "What am I supposed to do with this?" But somehow I thought she already knew. I could see it in the way she was looking at Marc, in the way her whole body had changed since he'd given her the ring. She looked lighter somehow, like she'd been carrying something heavy and had finally been allowed to set it down. "He said you'd know what to do," Marc said quietly. "He said you always knew what to do, even when you didn't think you did." The woman stood up then, still holding the ring, and I watched her walk over to the boy. She was tall and he was small, and when she knelt down in front of him they were almost eye to eye. "Marc," she said, and her voice was steady now, stronger. "Would you like to come home with me? Just for tonight, just so you don't have to sleep outside again." He nodded, very slowly, and I could see him trying not to cry again. "He said you'd ask that," he said. "He said you wouldn't be able to help yourself." The woman laughed then, a sound that was half sob and half joy, and I felt something crack open inside my chest. "Of course he did," she said. "He always knew me better than I knew myself." I watched them then, this woman and this boy who had found each other in the most impossible way, and I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Hope, maybe, or faith, or just the simple recognition that sometimes the world surprises you with its capacity for connection, for love to find a way even when everything seems lost. The woman stood up and reached for Marc's hand. "Come on," she said. "Let's go home." As they walked toward the exit I saw her slip the ring onto her finger, not the one where her wedding ring had been, that one was still bare, still pale, but onto her right hand, where it caught the light and threw small rainbows against the wall. Marc walked beside her, his small hand in hers, and I could see something in his face that hadn't been there before. Peace, maybe, or just the simple relief of not being alone anymore. The checkout girl was still crying when I finally paid for my milk and the small ceramic bowls, and she smiled at me through her tears. "Wasn't that something?" she said, and I nodded, not trusting my voice. I walked to my car thinking about the woman's wedding ring, the diamond one that had started everything, and realized I had never seen where it ended up. Somewhere in that small drama it had been forgotten, become unimportant compared to the plain gold band that had connected two grieving hearts across the impossible distance between life and death. Driving home I thought about David, whoever he was, and how he had somehow arranged for his wife to find exactly what she needed when she needed it most. I thought about Marc, sleeping somewhere warm tonight for the first time in who knows how long, and about the woman whose name I didn't even know but whose life had been changed completely in the space of 15 minutes. I thought about the milk growing warm in my back seat and the ceramic bowls that had reminded me of something I couldn't name, and realized that sometimes the most ordinary moments become the backdrop for the most extraordinary grace. Sometimes standing in line at the grocery store becomes witnessing a miracle, becomes being part of something larger than yourself, becomes understanding that love doesn't end just because death arrives. The boy's words echoed in my mind as I pulled into my driveway. "Your husband gave it to me." Such a simple sentence, such an impossible truth, and yet I had watched it change everything, had seen it transform accusation into understanding, stranger into family, ending into beginning. I sat in my car for a long time that night, thinking about all the ways we touch each other's lives without knowing it, all the messages we carry without realizing their weight. The woman had come to buy groceries and had found a son. The boy had been alone and had found a home. David had been dead but had somehow found a way to keep loving. And I had been just another stranger in line, buying milk and small things I didn't need, and had been changed by watching love find a way to continue, to reach across the impossible distance between heartbreak and healing, between loneliness and connection, between the end of one story and the beginning of another. The ceramic bowls sat on my kitchen counter that night, still wrapped in tissue paper, and I realized what they reminded me of. My grandmother's dishes, the ones she used for special occasions, the ones she said made everything taste better because they were made with love. I unwrapped them slowly, carefully, and set them on the shelf where the light would catch them, where they would remind me every day that sometimes the most beautiful things come from the most unexpected places. Sometimes a boy in torn shoes carries the message you most need to hear. Sometimes a stranger's grief becomes your own healing. Sometimes a dead man's love finds a way to keep growing, to keep giving, to keep connecting hearts across the vast distances we think separate us from each other. And sometimes, if you're very lucky, you get to witness it all unfold in the grocery store on a Tuesday afternoon, buying milk and small beautiful things, learning that miracles don't announce themselves with fanfare but arrive quietly, wearing torn shoes and carrying gold rings and the infinite capacity of love to find a way. 3 weeks later I saw them again at the same grocery store and everything had changed. The woman, Helen, I had learned her name from the local news story that ran about their unusual meeting, was pushing a cart filled with the kind of food you buy when you're cooking for two. Marc walked beside her, still small but different somehow, wearing new shoes that actually fit and a jacket that didn't have holes in the sleeves. I was buying those same ceramic bowls, more of them this time because I had broken one washing dishes and couldn't stop thinking about how fragile beautiful things are. Helen smiled when she saw me, the kind of smile that recognizes a shared witness to something sacred, and I found myself walking over to them without really deciding to. "How are you both doing?" I asked, and Marc looked up at me with those same old eyes, but there was something lighter in them now, something that hadn't been there before. "Good," Helen said, and I could see she meant it. "We're doing really good." But there was something else in her voice, something careful and measured, and I watched her exchange a look with Marc that seemed to carry weight. They were keeping something, I realized, some secret that sat between them like a third person in their conversation. "The story in the paper," I said, because I couldn't help myself, because I had read it 3 times and still couldn't quite believe what I had witnessed. It was beautiful. "About David's message." Helen's smile faltered slightly and she looked down at her hands. The plain gold ring was still there on her right hand, catching the light, but something about the way she held herself had changed. "Yes," she said quietly. It was quite a story. Marc was looking at her now with an expression I couldn't read, and I felt like I was standing at the edge of something I didn't understand. There was a tension between them that hadn't been there before, a careful distance that made me wonder if living together had been harder than either of them expected. "We should go," Helen said suddenly, and I could see her hands tightening on the shopping cart handle. "Marc has homework to finish." But Marc didn't move. He stood there looking at Helen with something like sadness in his young face, and I realized they had been having this conversation before I arrived, that my presence had just interrupted something that needed to be finished. "Tell her," Marc said quietly, and Helen went very still. "Marc," she said, and her voice was warning him about something. "She deserves to know," he said, and I could see tears starting in his eyes. "Everyone deserves to know." Helen looked at me then, really looked at me, and I saw something in her expression that made my stomach drop. Fear, maybe, or guilt, or just the terrible weight of carrying something too heavy for one person to hold. "Know what?" I asked, but I wasn't sure I wanted to hear the answer. Helen was quiet for a long moment, and I could see her struggling with something, weighing options I couldn't understand. Finally she sighed, a sound that seemed to come from somewhere deep inside her chest. "David didn't give Marc the ring," she said, and her voice was barely above a whisper. The words hit me like a physical blow and I felt the world tilt again, the way it had that day in the checkout line. "What do you mean?" Helen looked around the store, checking to see if anyone else was listening, then pushed her cart toward a quieter corner near the pharmacy. Marc and I followed, and I could see him wiping his eyes with the back of his hand. "David has been dead for 6 months, Helen said, and I could hear the exhaustion in her voice. "He died by suicide, just like Marc said. But he didn't give anyone a ring because he was cremated. There was no ring to give." I felt like I was falling, like the ground had disappeared beneath my feet. "Then how did Marc have it?" Helen looked at Marc, and he looked back at her, and I could see some kind of understanding pass between them. "Tell her," Marc said again, and this time his voice was gentle, encouraging. "I gave it to him," Helen said, and I could see her hands shaking. "The ring, I mean. It was David's wedding ring, the one he was wearing when he died. The hospital gave it to me with his other belongings." The silence stretched between us and I tried to process what she was saying, tried to understand how the story I had witnessed could be both true and false at the same time. "I had been going to that grocery store every Tuesday for months," Helen continued, her voice getting stronger. "Ever since David died, I couldn't stand being in the house alone, so I would go out and buy things I didn't need, just to be around people. And I kept seeing Marc there, This little boy who was obviously homeless, obviously hungry, and I wanted to help him but I didn't know how. She stopped talking and looked at Marc, and I could see love in her expression, the kind of fierce protective love that mothers have for their children. He was so proud, she said. Every time I tried to give him money or food, he would refuse. He said he wasn't a beggar, wasn't a charity case. But I could see he was starving. So you made up the story, I said, and it wasn't a question. Helen nodded, tears starting in her eyes. I had been watching him for weeks, and I knew he came to the store every Tuesday, same time as me. So I planned it. I put David's ring in his pocket when he wasn't looking, and then I pretended to lose my diamond ring and accused him of stealing it. I felt sick, betrayed, like everything I had believed about that day had been a lie. But the things he said about David, about the blue teapot, about you meeting at the fountain. I told him those things, Helen said, and her voice was breaking now. The night before, I found him sleeping behind the dumpster at the shelter, and I sat with him and told him about David, about our marriage, about how guilty I felt that I couldn't save him. I told him everything. Marc stepped closer to Helen then, and I could see him take her hand. She was crying, he said, looking at me. She was sitting there in the dark crying like her heart was broken, and I asked her why she was sad and she told me about her husband and how he killed himself and how she blamed herself. But why? I asked, and I could hear the confusion in my own voice. Why make up such an elaborate story? Helen looked at me with such pain in her eyes that I had to look away. Because I knew no one would believe that a homeless child deserved help just because he was hungry and alone. But everyone would believe in a miracle, everyone would want to be part of something magical and beautiful. She was right, I realized. If she had just walked up to Marc and offered him a home, people would have questioned her motives, would have wondered what was wrong with her, would have called social services and made everything complicated. But a message from beyond the grave, a love that transcended death, a divine intervention, that was something people could accept, could celebrate, could support. The whole thing was planned, I said, and I could hear the disappointment in my own voice. Not the whole thing, Marc said quietly. The part about being alone was real. The part about sleeping outside and being hungry was real. And the part about her needing someone to take care of was real too. Helen squeezed his hand and I could see fresh tears on her cheeks. I thought if I could just get him home, just get him safe, then I could figure out how to make it permanent. But then the story got picked up by the news, and suddenly everyone was talking about miracles and divine intervention, and I didn't know how to tell the truth without making everything worse. So you've been living a lie, I said. We've been living a life, Helen corrected, and there was something fierce in her voice now. Marc has been sleeping in a warm bed and eating regular meals and going to school. I have someone to cook for and worry about and love. The story might have been fake, but the family we've become is real. I looked at Marc, trying to understand how he felt about all of this, about being part of such an elaborate deception. And you're okay with lying to people? He was quiet for a moment, considering the question. My mom used to say that sometimes the truth isn't about facts, it's about love. She said sometimes you have to tell a story to help people understand something they couldn't see otherwise. Helen needed to help me but she couldn't figure out how, he continued, and I could see wisdom in his young face that shouldn't have been there. And I needed help but I was too proud to ask for it. So she made up a story that let us both get what we needed without anyone having to feel bad about it. But what about everyone else? I asked. What about all the people who were inspired by your story, who believed they had witnessed something miraculous? Helen looked at me then with something like defiance in her eyes. Did they witness something miraculous? She asked. A lonely woman and a homeless child found each other and became a family. How is that not a miracle? She was right, I realized. The method might have been deception, but the result was exactly what it appeared to be, two people who needed each other finding their way to connection, to love, to healing. The story about David might have been fiction, but the transformation it had enabled was absolutely real. So what now? I asked. Do you tell people the truth? Helen and Marc looked at each other again, and I could see they had already discussed this, had already made their decision. We've been thinking about that, Helen said. And we've decided that some stories are too important to deconstruct. The people who heard about us, Marc added, they went home and hugged their families a little tighter. They started believing in love again, started thinking maybe death isn't the end of everything. Why would we want to take that away from them? I stood there in the grocery store, surrounded by the mundane reality of fluorescent lights and checkout lines and people buying things they needed for their ordinary lives, and I tried to understand what they were asking me to do. They were asking me to be complicit in their deception, to keep their secret, to let the world go on believing in their beautiful lie. But I know the truth now, I said. Yes, Helen said simply. You do, and you trust me to keep it? Marc nodded solemnly. You were there that day. You saw how it felt when everyone believed in something beautiful. You saw how it changed people. He was right. I had felt it myself, that sense of witnessing something sacred, something that restored faith in the possibility of love transcending death. And I had carried that feeling with me for weeks, had let it change the way I saw the world, the way I thought about connection and loss and the ways we reach for each other across the vast distances of grief. What if someone investigates? I asked. What if they find out David was cremated, that there was no ring to give? Helen smiled then, a sad but peaceful smile. Then they'll discover that love finds a way, even when the people doing the loving have to help it along. They'll discover that sometimes the most important truths can only be told through stories, and that the difference between fact and truth isn't always as clear as we think. I looked at them both, this unlikely family born from necessity and deception and the deepest kind of love, and I realized they were asking me to choose between truth and truth, between facts and faith, between the story as it happened and the story as it needed to be. The ring, I said suddenly. David's ring. What happened to your diamond ring that day? Helen reached into her purse and pulled out the missing wedding ring, the one with the diamond that had started everything. I never lost it, she said. I slipped it off my finger when I was pretending to look for it. It was in my pocket the whole time. She held it out to me and I could see it clearly now, this expensive symbol of a marriage that had ended in tragedy, this prop in an elaborate performance designed to save two people who couldn't save themselves. I can't wear it anymore, she said. It reminds me too much of the person I was before, the person who couldn't figure out how to help a hungry child without creating an elaborate fiction. What will you do with it? Helen looked at Marc, and he smiled at her, a smile full of understanding and affection. We're going to sell it, she said. And use the money to help other kids like Marc, kids who are alone and hungry and too proud to ask for help. We're going to find ways to help them that don't require miracles, that don't require elaborate stories. We're going to find ways to help them that are simple and direct and true. I took the ring from her hand and held it up to the light, watching it throw rainbows against the wall the way it had that first day. It was beautiful, valuable, a symbol of love that had once been real and pure and full of hope. But now it was going to become something else, something that would feed children and house the homeless and continue the work of love in ways that were quieter but no less miraculous. You don't have to decide right now, Helen said gently. About keeping our secret, I mean. Take some time to think about it. But I already knew what I was going to do. I was going to keep their secret because they were right. Some stories are too important to deconstruct, some truths can only be told through fiction, and some miracles happen because people make them happen, not because they fall from the sky. I won't tell anyone, I said, and I meant it. Helen smiled and Marc hugged my waist, and I felt something settle in my chest, something that had been unsettled since that day in the checkout line. The story was more complicated than I had thought, more human and flawed and beautiful than the simple miracle I had first witnessed. But it was also more real, more true to the way love actually works in the world, messy and imperfect and requiring us to be creative, to be brave, to be willing to bend the rules when the rules aren't big enough to hold what we need them to hold. Walking to my car that day, I thought about the ceramic bowls I had bought, about the way beautiful things are fragile and need to be handled with care. I thought about Helen and Marc and the family they had created out of necessity and love and the willingness to tell the story that needed to be told, even if it wasn't the story that had actually happened. And I thought about David, the real David who had died alone and in pain, who had left behind a wife consumed with guilt and a wedding ring that would become the foundation for a different kind of love story. He hadn't sent a message from beyond the grave, hadn't orchestrated a meeting between his wife and a homeless child. But maybe, in some way, he had made it possible anyway, had left behind enough love and guilt and longing to inspire Helen to reach across the distance between herself and someone who needed her. The truth, I realized, was bigger than facts. The truth was that love finds a way, even when the people doing the loving have to help it along, even when they have to create elaborate fictions to overcome their own fears and pride and the complicated barriers that keep us from reaching for each other when we need to most. Some stories are too important to deconstruct, too necessary to abandon, too true to disbelieve. And sometimes the most beautiful miracles are the ones we make ourselves, with our own hands and hearts and willingness to bend the world just enough to let love through.